follow me on Twitter, at Jon Snow C4. Well, thanks very much indeed for making time for me. I'm very impressed with this turnout on a Friday morning. I suppose I wanted to start with the idea that there are things happening to everybody in this room right now that will be of use right the way through your life. And that I've found to be an absolute fact, that things that you're not learning in a formal setting, maybe much more in an informal setting, inform the rest of your life in a very strange way. I always wanted to be a Conservative MP. There's a startling statement. I wanted to be a Tory MP because when I was 6, my father was a headmaster in a school, and it was a faith-based school, Church of England, and it was chapel every Sunday night, and even at 6 I had to go, because he was a cleric. And one day I noticed sitting in the same row as us, a very unhappy-looking old man, with very droopy eyebrows and an oversized greatcoat. And I asked my mother who he was, and she said, well, your dad will tell you. And I asked my father who he was, and my father said, I'll introduce you to him next week. And the next week came along, he said, John, I want you to meet Mr. Harold Macmillan. He's the Prime Minister. Do you know what a Prime Minister is, young man? And I said, are you married to the Queen? He said, no, I am a Conservative politician, and I run the country. And with that, he then turned with his unhappy face and went off through the door, out to his Humber Super Snipe, and was driven away, purring away, to Birchgrove, which was an enormous country house that he lived in on the edge of our village. And I thought, who would have a car like that, oversized greatcoat like that, a house like that? I think I'd like to be a Conservative politician, run the country. Well, it's all been a bit of a flop, in fact. I can safely say I'm suffering downward social mobility. But in truth, what I just want to talk to you about briefly is something which I think is in many ways defining the times in which we've been living. And it centres on Iran, but really is all about America and us, and power. When I was exactly in my pre-expulsion year at Liverpool, we drove overland to India in a bus. There was a sort of organisation which enabled you to do this, but you had to agree to be one of the drivers or something, and I was a driver, and you had to take something cultural with you. It was a cultural exchange, although they never came back because there was always war in between. But we came back, and that's why I'm still here. And we took a close harmony 4-part Beatle band, and I sang bass, and we took a play, Sheridan's Rivals, heaven knows why. I think it was a set text for people who in these distant climes were attempting to do Oxbridge A-levels. So this curious jalopy made its way across Europe and Asia, and we passed through Iran. And in many ways, although India was quite unbelievable, a sort of knockout, sort of cultural clash, the place that stuck in my mind was Iran. Was driving along the Caspian Sea and then dipping down to Isfahan and Persepolis, and suddenly finding yourself in a country that was 6,000 years old and had plenty of evidence to support its sophistication and its history. And that was that. And then, over time, I became a hack, and I got sent to Iran because it looked as if there was going to be a revolution. And I was there in time to see Ayatollah Khomeini, the leader of the Islamic Revolution, land in Tehran, and I saw the Shah go, and I was there, although he went before Khomeini landed. And I was then there for the actual revolution, and then I was there for the seizure of the American embassy by the students. And this was a really amazing moment. I mean, absolutely fantastic. I mean, the millions and millions of people on the streets, and the entire diplomatic corps of the American embassy, 52 diplomats held hostage in their own embassy. It's an unimaginable thing nowadays that could happen, but it happened. And the Brits, in their vast embassy, huge, massive embassy, a two-campus embassy, bigger than York University by a country mile, vast, an old palace. And the Brits had had diplomatic relations with Iran for over 300 years. The Americans had had diplomatic relations for about 25 years. So there was a bit of a difference between our kind of perspective on what was going on. And amid this turmoil, I tried to think, now, why is this important? Why are the Americans in such a mess over all this? Why won't they treat with the revolutionaries and get their diplomats out? What's the problem? And I realized that they'd lost something enormous. They had invested an enormous amount. It had become really their stool pigeon. When you lifted off from the airport, you could look down out of the plane, and you would see rows and rows and rows of jumbo jets. You think, hang on a minute, this is admittedly a wonderful historic country, but it's not exactly, you know, cutting edge new world. What do they need those for? And they were troop carriers, they were refueling planes, they were military colours and the rest of it. And you realise that the Shah had allowed Iran to become a kind of bunkering port for America's interests in the region. And of course that hadn't really ultimately gone down very well with the people who lived there. And the revolution was as much a kind of counter-imperial revolution. And it was a strange thing because we didn't see America as in any way an imperialist power in those days. I mean, despite Vietnam and the rest of it. And yet that was really what it was when it came to Iran. But what was the real importance of this country? Well, why should any of us bother? Well, I suddenly realized, as I was talking to my crew, that the thing which they'd lost more than anything else was a listening post to listen to and watch the Russian atomic bomb tests in the Urals, just across the Caspian Sea. A brilliant place. And they'd lost it. It was now in the hands of the revolutionaries. And they really had no way now of actually checking what was going on in that critical part of Russia, which is where their nuclear bombs and rockets and all the rest of it were being developed. So suddenly, in the midst of the Cold War, they felt incredibly exposed. And it mattered enormously. So, because it was almost impossible to move around in Tehran on the day of the revolution, I thought we should go off and find this listening post. And the funny thing is that when we'd driven along the Caspian Sea in 1970, I had seen it. I knew what it was. I'd seen it. And the only reason I knew it was because I had lived in Yorkshire. And I'd lived in Yorkshire in the North Riding, and I had been past the Fylingdales early warning system, which was huge golf balls. So I knew what an early warning station might look like. And I had seen it in 1970. I'd seen it on the top of the hills, somewhere along the bottom of the Caspian Sea, but I couldn't remember where. So my poor crew had to accompany me as we drove the full length of the bottom of the Caspian Sea to try and find it. And on the day of the revolution, a few hours before nightfall, we spotted it at the far Afghan end of the Caspian Sea. There it was, up on the hilltops, these golf balls, unmistakable. We drove up there, we found two guys with a couple of Kalashnikovs over their knees. They were about 16, I should think. They weren't remotely interested in us, they were just sitting there. They were Revolutionary Guards and very proud of it, but they didn't really know what they were doing. So we gave them a cup of tea from our flask and the rest of it, and we made friends. And then we thought, let's get in. And I, of course, made to go into the first golf ball. My cameraman said, don't go in, you idiot, it's probably booby-trapped. So we solemnly picked up rocks and started throwing them in through the open door to try and see if we could trigger some sort of explosion. But nothing happened. And we got into the first of the golf balls, and the place was alive with very early, huge computers with vast amounts of paper spewing out with hieroglyphics and wobbles and lines and the rest of it. We had no idea what we were looking at, but we filmed like video. And we went to each of these domes and filmed everything we could. And then we went into the living quarters, and the pajamas were still on the bed, the food was still, the breakfast was still on the tables. The Americans had fled that morning. It was absolutely amazing. The thing, there we were, right at the cutting edge of the East-West Cold War pinpoint. And so we took everything and put it in our bags and our film and stuff, and we drove back to Tehran, got back about 2 in the morning, got into the Intercontinental Hotel where we were staying, where only the previous day we'd seen people pouring claret down the drains, because the new Islamic revolutionary situation was such that you could not have alcohol on the premises, and this amazing sort of crew and sort of gold medal red wines of 40 years of age, etc., were going down the manhole. It was not tasty. And went to bed, and about 4 o'clock in the morning, on my door. Hello? Hello? Yes? Look, I need to speak to you. Well, who are you? I'm from the British Embassy. So I let the man in, and he was the defence attaché from the British Embassy. He said, look, we've reason to believe you've been somewhere rather sensitive. I said, well, the whole country is sensitive, let's face it. And he said, well, yes, but you've been to the early warning station. I said, well, so what did we have? We reason to believe you may have taken images of things that might give the other side some kind of information. And I said, well, I don't really want to discuss it with you. I'm a journalist and you're a military attaché. We have our jobs to do, and I've got mine and you've got yours. He said, no, it's not quite as simple as that. He said, I must ask you to give me the footage. I said, well, I'm not going to give you the footage, am I? He said, well, no, you really must. And I said, well, you can't make me, and you're not exactly in charge here anymore, are you? Not exactly, but it's still matters a great deal, and you've got to think about your own children. And I said, I haven't got any children, but you will have them one day. It all got very ridiculous. But anyway, at the end of it all, we did a negotiation. I said, look, when we put this stuff together, it was very early video, we will show you what we're doing, and if there's something particularly offensive that we really don't care about, I mean in the sense that it's not important to our story, then we'll take it out and abide by them. But the condition is, you've got to give me something in return. And he said, well, what do you want to know? And I said, well, just before he fell, the Shah took delivery of 30 of the latest state-of-the-art American Foxbat fighter jets. And if they fall into the hands of the Russians, clearly that's a complete disaster. Yes, it would be. And I said, well, where are they? Oh, he said, that's easy. I'll tell you. But I'll only tell you once you've shown me that. So when we looked at all, and actually most of the pictures are rather boring, it's paper coming out of computers. But anyway, he said, no, can't possibly put that out. That bit there, well. I thought he might have a seizure. But anyway, we did agree to cut out the bits. And he said, fine, you need to go to Shiraz, second roundabout from the town centre, turn right, left at the next traffic lights, left again at the traffic lights after that, and you'll find yourself out on an open road. And on the left-hand side, there's an air base. At the far end, there are some bunkers, and in the bunkers, you'll see Foxbats. And it was true, they were there, and we were able to film them. And so we've done that sort of a deal. Now, why do I tell you this detailed and absurd and bonkers story? Because, this was the moment when America was humiliated in a way that it had never experienced, ever. Not until 9/11 did it suffer such humiliation. And it turned out to be a real historic turning point, because it decided that the way to deal with the revolution was to say effectively it hadn't happened, and they wouldn't recognize it, and they wouldn't talk to it. And so this enormous power, this 90 million strong country, this sheer bastion, sheer Islamic bastion, this 6,000-year-old civilization was to be shut away and to have no place. The problem was, which they had not really foreseen, was that, of course, it was, although a country that hadn't invaded any other country in 300 years, it had enormous influence in all the countries around. All the countries around. And this is what's so difficult for people to understand. In talking about Iran, Iraq, Syria, Afghanistan, we're talking about places that have incredibly porous borders. I was in Qom, the holy city of Shirdan in Iran last July. And I was there on the day of the third Imam's birthday, big moment. And pilgrims were swilling around the place in huge numbers, swirling around. And some had come in from Iran, some had come in from Syria, Some had come in from Afghanistan. None of them had passports. None of them had been through any kind of official border process. They were pilgrims. They'd come in buses. The buses had been cleared, and that was about it. And I looked at these people and I thought, did Bush, did Blair, did anybody understand the complexity of the interrelations that exist between these countries? How can you choose one and isolate it, or choose another and invade it? Because in doing so, you will be doing something which affects an entire lattice work of life, which will spread its tentacles, right across. It's like stamping on a piece of glass and seeing it shatter in lots of different directions. And somewhere the threads will affect perhaps even as far as us. And in that moment, I sort of realized that we were at the beginning of a very worrying journey. And the journey may be about to reach a new climax. Because I was in Iran for the election of Rouhani. And Iran, it's a great thing. If you can isolate a country, you can then say things of it that no one will be able to prove are not true. So basically, I'm exaggerating now. You could assume they eat babies, or the whole thing was completely mad. They were such bad people. Iran was such a bad entity that you could literally say anything you liked about it, and it became a kind of pariah state, and yet nobody quite knew whether it was true. And of course, within the 90 million people, there are some of the most gifted engineers, scientists, teachers, religious scholars, people of all sorts of capacities. And oddly enough, of all the countries in that region, it's the only country I've been to that looks west. It looks west. They want a Western way of life, effectively, but one which is true to an acceptance and a devotion to a particular branch of Islam. It's a really interesting and extraordinary place. And not talking to it has got us into all sorts of trouble. Amazingly, even at the worst of times, they actually bailed America out in Afghanistan and ourselves. When Massoud, the leader of the Northern Alliance, early in the Afghan war was assassinated, it was the Iranians who managed to find somebody to succeed him and helped the Americans to sort the thing out. The Iranians are interested in keeping Afghanistan stable because beyond it lives Pakistan. Pakistan is one of the most unstable countries in the world and one of the gravest threats because it's nuclear, massively nuclear, and nobody really knows quite what the controls of the nuclear are. And this is something. If you ask, who should be afraid of a Pakistani bomb? Well, of course, we will all say we all are. But there is one country which is much more afraid. If you stand in Tehran and you ask the question, what are you afraid of in terms of nuclear? They're afraid of Pakistan because the first target would be the capital of the sheer entity that is Iran. And that's not the way we see it. We just see them as a threat. Anyway, somehow, this man, Rouhani, who after all actually was the nuclear negotiator in 2003, and offered a deal which is very similar to the one, almost identical to the one that's now on the table, but was rejected because they were a pariah, filthy state. He got elected, and it's a very interesting thing because, of course, you politics people, there are some in here, you politics people will think that the democracy that is practiced in Iran is hardly democratic. When it's true that the presidential slate has to be approved by the supreme leader, but actually there's a huge choice on the slate. Campaigning around the country, going with the various candidates, and there were 6, we were wrong. We assumed the person who would win would be the current nuclear negotiator there, a guy called Jalili. Pretty hard-nosed character, a veteran of the Iran-Iraq War, another grubby moment in East-West relations, and of course armed both sides. But anyway, we were quite wrong, because actually my Farsi is not good enough to understand what happened in the television debates. And amazingly, in this country, which is supposed to be not quite like us, the television debates absolutely decided the election, because Rouhani in the two successive debates, completely stole the show. I mean, he was breathtakingly good. He talked about resolving the nuclear crisis. He talked about the reality that sanctions were making a mess of their economy. He talked about what could be done and that he was the person who could do it. I've been there before. I know these people. I know the whites of their eyes. I know how this works. Trust me. And he got 51% of the vote. And I believe it was a genuinely democratic result. I don't believe that it was fixed because I don't think the Supreme Leader knew who he wanted to take over. I actually think that they got into such a mess. They were so worried by the Green Revolution, which had happened in 2009, that they'd seen what had happened to Mubarak. I mean, not a man they had any affection for, but if somebody as tough as that could be kicked out in a week, what would happen to them? So let's see if we can come forward with something completely new and see what the people make of this. You have the choice. You've got the old hard man in Jalili, or you've got let's see what happens. And of course, there were others beside. There was another hardliner who was the mayor of Tehran. Actually, brilliant guy, but he was a technocrat, and he'd greened the city. He'd sowed 10 million trees. If you go to Tehran now, it's an awful concrete jungle, a sort of bit of an eyesore in such a beautiful country. But he's managed to produce trees in every street and every park, and now you look down on it, it's an extraordinarily green city. But anyway, there it was. That was the choice, and people made the choice, and they voted for this guy. And he's brought about this amazing moment. And this week, we'll be getting these Iran talks. And I believe, and I hope, that we will emerge from them with Iran reintegrated and embraced. It will be a long process, but with the great intent to reintegrate and embrace Iran into the family of nations. And when we do, we will be blessed, because there are so many problems right across that end of the world which Iran can play a very key role in resolving. Because you ostracize somebody, they ostracize the people you love. So, for example, they have been hostile to Israel and Israeli interests. They have been hostile in terms of supporting Hezbollah, in supporting Hamas. And yet, where is the biggest Jewish community outside, in the Middle East outside Israel? Tehran. I mean, Iran has more Jews than any other country in that region. Do we hear that? No, they're filthy people. They're filthy people, and they must be kept at arm's length and ought to know. And so, there we are. We innocent people in a far-off land have allowed all this to happen. And then we've allowed it to be vastly complicated by invading a country of which we knew little and cared even less. It's an amazing thing. A friend of mine was one of the 4 academics who went in to see Tony Blair in Downing Street just on the eve of the Iraq War. The Foreign Office, which was much more ambivalent about having anything to do with the war, partly because we have a lot of good Arabists in the Foreign Office, were so desperate that they summoned up 4 academics from Cambridge and the one from London to go and see the Prime Minister, to try and talk him out of and to explain to him what would happen if you went into a country like Iraq. At the end of 1.5 hours, all Blair said to them was, "But you do agree, he's a very bad man." Well, there are a lot of bad men in the world, so if we're going to go around knocking them off, just look at the decapitation in Libya, in Egypt. I'm not advocating going for tyrants, but it's not for us to resolve the leadership of these countries. And doing so has left us in an utterly disastrous situation in which we now are confronted with Syria, where we have no purchase. We have absolutely no locus, no purchase, and no mechanism for seeing how we can resolve it. And it's absolutely because we lost all kudos, all credibility, all integrity by misbehaving so badly over the last 20, 25 years. And it puts the journalist in a very difficult position, because I had been there. I knew what a terrible mistake it was. But you're paid to go on and give a balanced account and will pass Ofcom standards and the rest of it. And we're all regulated, and boy, do I need regulating. We have to give a dispassionate account and let people judge. Well, now we need to judge, and we need to put our shoulders to the wheel and recognise that beyond ourselves there are things we need to know about, and we need to have a view about, and we need to try to prevent some of the mistakes that we've made in our lifetimes, in these 20, 25 years. you know, we've been at war, although we haven't noticed it, we've been at war for a longer continuous time as Britain. Britain has been at war for a longer continuous time than any time since the 19th century. It's an amazing thought. And we're still at war this day. Well, I've talked a lot of rambling nonsense, but that was the sort of thing I wanted to talk to you about. I'm not prepared to talk about anything you like. We can talk about journalism, we can talk about life, death, anything you want. But I wanted to talk about it because Iran is my passion. And it's the case, even though I'm an Africa war, because I did VSO in Uganda, it's informed my life ever since, in the end, the place that will be etched on my heart will be Iran. Thank you very much.